The real treat today, of course, is our guest speaker, Simona de Nepi. Ms. de Nepi is the curator of the Schusterman collection of Judaic at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. I will not even attempt to read her entire and very impressive CV, except to say that she has been a curator at the Museum of the Jewish People in Tel Aviv, at the Tel Aviv University, at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, at the National Gallery in London, and has gotten degrees or certificates from places that you have heard of, like Cambridge, and hopefully the Hebrew University and Tel Aviv University, but also Courtauld Institute of Art, which I looked up and is awfully impressive. And she holds a BA and an MA. She curated today's exhibit on the Dreyfus affair. I asked Simona if she was going to say a little bit about the Dreyfus affair itself, in case some students haven't quite yet gotten to it in their classes, and she assured me that she will. So without further ado, let's welcome Simona de Nepi.
Thank you so much, Alan, for the kind words. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Rona. Thank you, Trice, for organizing all this. So my name is Simona de Nepi, and I am Charles and Lynn Schusterman, curator of Judaic at the Museum of Fine Arts. But today I'm actually going to speak to you about an exhibition I curated at the Manifesto, the Museum of the Jewish People in Tel Aviv, called Dreyfus. The story of a French Jewish family. You can see the poster of the exhibition and the catalog on the screen. And this was an exhibition that I curated 5 years ago, so it's really a treat and a wonderful opportunity for me to revisit a project that I loved so much, but I didn't have the chance to think about since I moved on to different areas of Jewish culture, more into the Jewish arts direction. So, as wonderful projects often do, this also started by chance when Yael Ruiz, she's the great-granddaughter of Alfred Dreyfus, and you see me with her, very happy, the night of the opening at the Museum of the Jewish People. This was really her initiative. She felt very strongly that the Dreyfus affair still has a great deal to teach in terms of human rights and freedom of speech and racism, unfortunately. And also she feels that her great-grandfather usually seen more as a symbol than as a man, as she wanted to rectify that. So she turned to us, to the museum, and she asked us to mount an exhibition about the Dreyfus affair. So we did in 1 year, which is very fast for when it goes to putting up an exhibition. And I realized pretty quickly into the research of the exhibition that there had been a number of course, books, but also museum exhibitions made, and that they tended to focus on the public side of the affair that we all know from history books, on the famous judicial saga, and especially on the role that the press had, the massive, powerful role of the French press during the affair. I certainly wanted to do that and to tell the story of the affair, and I will in a minute, but I also wanted to show a lesser known side of the affair. It's what I like to call the private affair, and it's the story of Dreyfus, the man, who he was, and he was an extraordinary, really, that was my pleasure in the exhibition, is getting to know Dreyfus, and his young wife, Lucie, and his brother, Mathieu, who really abandoned everything just to devote himself to get his brother free. And then, so I thought I would take you through the exhibition, because the exhibition was rather large and complex, I chose certain sections and images that I'd like to show you. So this is the outside of the exhibition, so I'll actually take you through it. And as you come in, the exhibition was actually divided into three broad thematic areas. One was what I call the public affair, the story of the affair, and that includes the press. The second is the private affair, the story of the family and those closest to Alfred Dreyfus. And the third, and this was really new and original and somewhat debatable in a way, is what we call the aftermath, to look at what happened to the Dreyfus family, but also to the French Jews at large after 1906, especially during the Second World War and then in the period after the war. But as you came in the exhibition, as you came in the door, what you would have found was this very, we felt, powerful and also troubling, powerful image of Alfred Dreyfus. This is an image from a London publication that is based on a photograph that was taken right after his degradation ceremony. And this is the moment where he's really publicly humiliated and really thrown away from the French army. We wanted a strong beginning. And we see, in a way, Alfred Dreyfus shouting his innocence. He would have never shouted, he was not the sort of man he would have shouted, but you can see that in a letter that he wrote about 3 months into his arrest to the Minister of Interiors, you can see, and we also had it on the glass case, that he says that he was sentenced for the worst crime a soldier could commit, and he's innocent, and I do not beg for amnesty or pity, but for justice. So he was really a man of honor, and that's what counted to him the most. And to his left, you can see folded in the glass case a replica of Alfred Dreyfus's uniform, which was made for an Israeli documentary. So we created that. But then really, that's when we started to tell the incredibly complex and complicated story. It wasn't easy, and I will actually read it to you, because the story lasted 12 years, and in these 12 years there were so many characters, individuals involved, and so many twists and turns that it's sometimes difficult to remember the details. So we created the sort of first wall. As you can see, the story unfolds on the left. On the right we had an actual timeline and chronology of the main events. And then we also accompanied the story with a visual representation of the main events through covers of a hugely popular newspaper called Le Petit Journal that every weekend came out with a supplement only on the Dreyfus affair. So, and I will read to you, this should be the only time in my talk where I actually read to you, the story. I want to be, to be precise. So this is the story unfolds, trying to recap what happened from 1894, October 1894 to July 1906. And it's the actual text that you would have seen on the wall. On a fine Monday morning, October 15th, 1894, Dreyfus, a 35-year-old artillery captain, was called for inspection to the Ministry of War. Upon his arrival, he was led to the office of the Chief of General Staff. A few lines from a letter were dictated to him. How odd, he thought, this handwriting text was used to frame him. From that very moment, everything spun out of control. He was arrested on the spot for having passed military secrets to the Germans, jailed in the Paris military prison, and denied communication with his family. After weeks of isolation and illegal interrogation, he was tried by a court-martial and convicted of high treason and sentenced to solitary confinement for life. On January the 5th, 1895, soldiers, officials, journalists, and invited guests gathered in the courtyard of the École Militaire, of the military school, to witness Dreyfus's public degradation ceremony. The expelled officer had his military ranks ripped off his uniform and his sword broken. Beyond the gates, the angry crowd shouted death to the Jews. 2 months later, he was deported to Devil's Island off the northeastern coast of French Guiana, just north of Brazil. Here he spent the next 4 years imprisoned in inhumane conditions and deprived of any human contact. It was only in the summer of 1899 that, thanks to the efforts of his wife Lucie, his brother Mathieu, and men such as Lieutenant Picard, who identified the real spy, and the writer Emile Zola, who penned the celebrated JuSt article, it was only then that a second trial was held. And you can see it on screen, the moment I think where the verdict is read. Due to the outrage, of Dreyfus' supporters, a second guilty verdict followed. Due to his feeble state, however, he was pardoned by the President of the Republic and he was at last reunited with his family. It would take 7 more years for Alfred Dreyfus' name to be cleared, the previous verdicts annulled, and for him to be declared an innocent man. So that's the story of 12 years of ordeal for Alfred Dreyfus. And in those 12 years, 5 he was imprisoned. 4 years he was on Devil's Island, and we will see in what conditions. And this is the wonderful photo of that day, that afternoon in July, where he was readmitted into the army, and he was also awarded the Legion of the Cross of Honor, which was a great honor in the French Republic, in the French army. I'll just very quickly show you a section that we did called Why Dreyfus? How could it be that in the land of emancipation, the first country in Europe to give a full emancipation to Jews, such an atrocious case of anti-Semitism occurred? And we have an entire wall trying to explain that, and we really linked it to political, economic, and social circumstances in France at that time. Most of all of the catastrophe and the trauma that France went through following the loss in the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, when the region of Alsace-Lorraine then passed on to the Germans. And this painting, which is very emblematic, it's a personification of Alsace. It's Alsace dressed as a woman mourning in black, and she's wearing in her hair, I don't know if you can see it, but she's wearing the tricolor of the French Republic. So, we can discuss it later, but there were the right circumstances for the extreme right wing and the anti-Semitic parties to sort of blame the Jews for the situation, for the economic crisis. And this is where this man that you see, Edouard Tourmont, who's often called the Pope of French anti-Semitism, really became the protagonist of the story. Now, I'm sure you've heard that the Dreyfus affair split France into two, and that the press played a pivotal role in this phenomenon. The truth is that for the first 3 years of the affair, no one spoke about Dreyfus except those closest to him. I mean, publicly, the press was clearly on the anti-Dreyfus side. So this should be clear. There was no debate in the press going on in the first 2 years that was in Devil's Island. The first to really react and act were the anti-Semitic camps headed by Edouard Tourmont. He founded the Antisemitic League of France. I'm talking about the late 1880s. He also wrote a few years prior, La France Juive. It was a massive bestseller. That came, I think, into 100 editions. He was so successful. I think 1886. And La France Juive is fundamental because in it, of course, he blamed the Jews for every ill imaginable in France. And yes, he talked about Jews being Christ killers, so religious anti-Semitism, and yes, about filthy capitalism, so the economic strand, brand of anti-Semitism, but he also spoke about racial anti-Semitism. Those were the years, the 1880s, where in Germany and France we know that the blood was coming more and more into the idea of Aryan French against Jewish Semites was more and more discussed. So he found the reason why it's so important for the Dreyfus affair, because he was the editor of the magazine that you see, La Libre Parole, which was the mouthpiece of the French Antisemitic League. And as early as November 1894, that means a couple of weeks after Dreyfus's arrest, information was leaked to Edouard Roman and immediately published very violent attacks on Dreyfus. You can see there a cover saying the traitor, and the inscription, the writing "Out of France, Jews, France for the French" came out one day after Dreyfus's conviction. Dreyfus was tried and convicted by a court-martial behind closed doors on the 22nd of December 1894. The following day, he issued this very violent and radical title. So we decided to, sorry, I have to do this all the time because I cannot see. So, okay. So we decided to devote a whole wall to the anti-Dreyfusards, to all of those who attacked Dreyfus and believed that he should stay on Devil's Island. And it was a time for graphic artists on that side, on the anti-Dreyfusard camp, was an incredible time. They actually became very rich. They created posters and comic strips and magazines and caricatures and board games and postcards, everything you can think, sort of marketing, real marketing around this affair. And it was, I could have shown you so many images, but I've actually chosen the most gruesome. In 1899, at the peak of the Dreyfus affair, that is to say during the second trial held in Rennes, a series of 51 posters called The Museum of Horrors was published. 51. It was actually difficult to choose a few of them for the exhibition and for the catalog, because they are such brilliant, awful and brilliant expression of the anti-Semitic hatred. So I'm just showing you a couple. This is Dreyfus himself, and it was typical of this series to show Dreyfus and his supporters sort of hybrids between man and beast. And they were very imaginative. Here we have Dreyfus as a snake, of course the traitor, with multiple heads of snakes. And then we have Emile Zola, the famous French novelist who defended Dreyfus with the very influential article J'accuse that we will see later. He's sitting on a pile of novels, his novels, and the title says The King of Pigs. And he's smearing excrements on the map of France. So he was bringing shame to France. There were many others that I showed also in the catalog. I also want to show you some, you won't see it, but just so you know that this existed, that sort of wooden box. A private collector in Belgium lent a walking stick called casse-tête, brick head, and they would be used during anti-Semitic demonstrations and rallies to hit Jews if they saw any, and to crash and break the windows of Jewish shops. So it was a very violent and terrifying time for Jews in France in the 1890s. What was happening on the opposite side? Now, as I said at the beginning, all was quiet. The only people that were fighting for Dreyfus and that believed that he was innocent were his immediate families, especially his wife and his brother. Zadok Khan was the chief rabbi of France. And you can see in this letter, if you can make out the actual date, that is the 23rd of December 1894, one day after Dreyfus's conviction, he writes to the governor of the prison and he says, I'd like to go and visit the unfortunate, the unlucky Captain Dreyfus to bring him the solace of religion. And we could open a whole new thing about what happened in the Jewish community at that time. Many in the Jewish community believed that he was guilty. They had no reason to think otherwise. They had no information. But Zadok Khan actually, from the very start, sided with Alfred Dreyfus. And then, really, everything started to change when this man, Lieutenant Picard, he was by no means a friend of the Jews. In fact, he was there that very first day when Dreyfus was taken to the office and framed. He didn't know what was happening, but he was there physically. He was named in late 1895 head of the intelligence services. And the following year, he started to investigate the matter, and he came to the conclusion that the real culprit was Major Ferdinand Esterhazy. I won't go into the details, but he identified the handwriting against the memorandum, the bordereau, that was used as evidence against Dreyfus. So he starts to investigate the matter. He brings it to his superiors, and of course his silence is sent first to Eastern France, and then to Tunisia, and then he's arrested. So these are, I think it's important to tell you what was going on while the public did not know about the sort of the innocent, the fact that Dreyfus was innocent. So I'm showing you, we had an entire wall, as you can see, of the Dreyfus camp, but I'm only showing you two images. One really became the manifesto of the Dreyfus struggle. There is a saying in France called truth lies at the bottom of the well. So in this painting we see a naked woman clearly trying to escape from a well, and she's held down by two men. One is holding a sword, so he represents the army, and the other one, dressed in black, represents the clergy. So the supporters of Dreyfus clearly felt that the army and the clergy were the two main forces in France at that time who were keeping the truth from being revealed. And the Dreyfus affair, as you know, still now reached well beyond the borders of France. This is an American publication, New York, I think, 1898. And it says, the peril of France at the mercy of the octopus. The octopus is the French army that is squeezing and holding tight Dreyfus himself, Emile Zola, the French novelist, Colonel Picard, that we've seen a moment ago, and two women, two personifications of honor and justice. So the Dreyfus affair was having a huge, sort of making noise on the international level. And this I like to call the ping-pong match, because it's effectively what happened. Every time that one side would publish a poster or comic strip, after 2 days, a week, the opposite side would come out with exactly the same product, the same means. So Dreyfus is the traitor represented the main ministers who believed in his guilt, and after a week the Fusar issued Dreyfus is innocent, and you can recognize in the center the figure of Colonel Picard. And Pierre, the son of Alfred Dreyfus, tells us that he learned about the Dreyfus affair from this comic strip that you can see on the left, the story of an innocent, because he and his daughter, his sister were really shielded by Lucie. I don't know how, but they were from this whole horrific story. And after a week again, you had Histoire d'un Traître. So this was going on all the time with board games and with postcards and so on. Now, in the exhibition, we decided to devote two special sections to Emile Zola and Theodor Herzl. Why did we do that? Because in the case of the first, we know that Emile Zola, the famous French novelist, who really turned the whole case upside down when he wrote this article, JuSt, he had a huge influence on the development of the story. We will see that in the case of Theodor Herzl, it's the opposite. It's what effect had the Dreyfus affair on Theodor Herzl thinking, and really on the history of Zionism, political Zionism. So in JuSt came out 2 days after that the real culprit, Major Esterhazy, was tried and acquitted. So he wrote an open letter to the president in the liberal law, where he named individuals, ministers, army officials, handwriting experts, who had lied, who had covered up the conspiracy, and who continued to do so. And he knew that by making names, he would be sued for libel. That's what he wanted, because he knew that the whole thing had gone to sleep. So he orchestrated this, and indeed he was tried, he was sort of accused of libel, he was tried twice, convicted twice, and he fled to London. He stayed for a year in London and then came back. He would die in 1902 at home from a gas leakage, and someone thinks that it was actually murder. But then, 4 years later, his remains were transferred to the Pantheon in a grand celebratory funeral for Emile Zola. That very day, during that ceremony, Dreyfus was present and he was shot by an extreme right-wing journalist. He survived, but as late as 1906, this was still going on. And then, I also want to share with you the fact that the great-granddaughter of Emile Zola, Martine Leblond Zola, who had never been to Israel before, came especially for the exhibition opening, and she was interviewed by the press and on TV, and it was very meaningful for us to have her there. And then we asked the opposite question for Theodor Herzl, this young journalist who was living in Vienna, but at the time he was in Paris because he was a correspondent for the Viennese newspaper Neue Freie Presse, and he was present in the courtyard of the École Militaire when the degradation was happening, and he heard the shouting death to the Jews, and he saw the anti-Semitic rallies in the days and months following that, spreading like an epidemic throughout France. And we don't know at that point how far along his thinking of a Jewish state was. We know that 2 years later, he wrote the Jewish state. There is no doubt that even if he had already started to think about the fact that the Jews could not integrate and live in Europe safely, this was really, this did it for him. It was a confirmation that they needed their own state in the Jewish homeland. So it's really the start of political Zionism. And we borrowed this drawing from the Jewish Museum in Paris. When I saw it, I thought, I couldn't believe it, this is so brilliant. We see in one room, and conversing, we assume, Theodor Herzl, who's standing and talking and probably maybe looking at his writings for the Jewish state, and sitting on the sofa we have, intently listening, we see Alfred Dreyfus and Emile Zola. This was made in the 1970s in France, and it really represents how the three men were linked. Georges Méliès was the pioneering figure of cinema with the Lumière brothers. he made the famous trip to the moon, and he was a supporter of Dreyfus. So we decided to show in its entire length of 13 minutes the film The Dreyfus Affair. So it showed the story from the start until 1899, which is when he made it. Clearly, from a sympathetic standpoint, he had a sort of humble iron worker who looked like Dreyfus play his part. He himself, Georges Méliès, played the part of the lawyer. And this film, the first political film in cinema history, was censored in France until 1950. Very, very late. And now we go on to my favorite parts of the exhibition and what I think was really new in a way in the exhibition, which is the private affair. The behind the scenes, what I call the lesser known part of the story, what was happening with Alfred and with Lucie. So we decided, this is the designer's mock-up. We had the most brilliant design firm, Israeli firm, to do this for us. We decided to visualize Lucie at home in Paris and Mathieu, the brother, on one hand with Paris at the time of the Exposition Universelle in 1900, and on the other hand we have Devil's Island, like that, with very large photographs suspended from the ceiling. And I would say that the item that more than anything else really cracks open Dreyfus's brain and soul is his cahier de travail, his notebook. I went to the Bibliothèque Nationale and begged them to loan it to us, but I understand they didn't, so we made some reproductions. These are the pieces of paper that he used every day to keep his soul and his spirit alive. And this is where I found out that this man was sort of a Renaissance man. Yes, he was an army man, he had discipline and control and so on, but he was an intellectual, he was a very emotional man. He taught drawing and mathematics at a boys' school. So in these pages you see so many beautiful drawings. These maybe doodles, but how beautiful they are. And in the same pages you see that he was translating Shakespeare and quoting from Kant and doing all sorts of things that you never expect from someone of his sort of position to do. He also wrote in 1901 a book called 5 Years of My Life that you can read, it's in every library. And here he's telling about La Double Boucle, about the time when there were rumors spread that he had tried to escape and it wasn't true. So this horrible device was created where he would be shackled to his bed at night with a double iron bar. He couldn't move. He was kept like this for 3 months. So he actually, not just the isolation, deprivation, for 4 years he underwent physical torture. There was forced labor as well, so you see him on the right in a photo we found in the Brandeis archive. He's actually collecting wood on Devil's Island in boiling temperatures. And on the other side, on the left-hand side, you would have the young Lucie, and what is known in France as the frère admirable, the admirable brother, Mathieu, who was 2 years older than Dreyfus, and their life, Paris at the time, and the thread between, on the opposite side, like behind the photo of Lucie and Mathieu, you could see photos of Pierre and Jeanne, the 2 children who were about 3 and 4 years old when the affair broke out. And what linked these 2 worlds were the letters, the beautiful letters that were exchanged, especially between Lucie and, say, between Matthew and Lucie and Alfred. They really sort of kept him alive. And we brought original letters from the National Archives in France, the National Library in France, and other important libraries. And here I thought I would show you one, because I don't have time to show you more. This is a letter that Alfred Dreyfus wrote at the end of January 1895. At that time, he hadn't arrived yet on David's Island. He was on another island, mid-ocean. And he writes very poignant, I think, lines to Lucie. So keep in mind, this is again about 3 months from the arrest. So it's very clear what he was thinking. He was suicidal at that point already. So early on he was ready to die, and he just kept living because of his name and his reputation. And there's another powerful thing that he said in the letter, which I haven't copied here. He says to Lucie, I am suppressing my emotional and intellectual part and only living like an animal, because only like that I won't suffer and I can live, only as an animal. And that is so far from the truth, because we know from the cahier de travail, from his notebook, that he just couldn't suppress his intellectual and emotional side. And he did quite the opposite. So the private affair continues on the wall, adjacent wall, with more photos from the private Dreyfus family. Lovely photos, unexpected photos. The one on the left is Alfred Dreyfus when he was 14 years old in uniform, and the one that I particularly love on the right, where Dreyfus, he looks like a dandy or sort of dapper figure, well dressed. This was a year before he got married in 1890. But we also brought from, again, the Dreyfus family and the Jewish Museum in Paris, personal objects that were in Alfred Dreyfus's home. For example, on the right you see the initial LH, Lucia Damar. This was Lucie's personal prayer book. And on the left you have a rug inscribed in Hebrew with a scene depicting and with writing about the 3 Jewish festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. This to me was important because it showed that Dreyfus was connected to his Jewish roots. It's often said the contrary. We had many more objects. We had their Jewish wedding certificate, the ketubah, we had the invitation to the wedding, all original artifacts that we brought from collections in France and America and Israel. So I come to rehabilitation at last. I'll be quick because I know that we want to leave time for questions. As I said, I anticipated earlier, he would have to wait after he went home for presidential pardon. He had to wait 6 more years for his name to be cleared. The previous verdicts were annulled and he was basically declared innocent. And we created a wall where you can see the cover of Corriere della Sera, an Italian daily, showing the moment of rehabilitation at the École Militaire. And we also showed on the right-hand side postcards that were issued at that time throughout Europe, like this one showing Dreyfus happily coming out of the military school. Now, I want to leave time for questions, but the exhibition actually went on. It went on to show what happened to the Dreyfus family after the affair. Dreyfus, he couldn't hold himself. He actually volunteered in the First World War, which is incredible to comprehend for us. His son was also artillery captain, and this is a letter sent to him where he says, have you been made captain yet? Because of anti-Semitism, we always have to do 10 times more than the others to obtain the same results. And then a wall about the time when he died. He was 75 years old, and a small ceremony was held at the Montparnasse cemetery. I'll just conclude with the absolute favorite photo in the exhibition. It's Alfred Dreyfus a year before his death. He was 74 years old, and the 19th century French artillery captain is wearing white sneakers, which I adore, and he's holding and smiling with his 3 great children. Now the little boy on the front, his name is Charles, he's still alive, he's 92 years old. He came, I had the pleasure of having dinner with him in Paris, and he came to the opening, and he's the only person left living who knew Dreyfus, his grandfather. So the exhibition went on, but I'd like to conclude with this lovely positive photo. And please, if you have any questions, I'd love to answer. Thank you.